So next up, we have Rob Richardson. He's a Microsoft MVP, published author, frequent speaker, and a core organizer of Arizona's GIF Camp. If you don't know GIF Camp and you're in the US, please check them out. You know, code plus charity, amazing stuff. Now, from the keynote, right, we were talking about refactoring. And how can you refactor with confidence? Well, we touched a little bit on that, right? You need a little bit of testing. And how can you get confidence in testing? Well, Rob is going to help us out to get more confidence using Cypress Tests. Rob, are you online?
I am.
All right.
Thanks for the introduction.
Cool. Please take it away.
Very nice. Today we're going to look at gaining confidence with Cypress Tests. Now, I'm Rob Richardson. Thank you for the introduction. Here's the part where I tell you I am definitely going to post the slides on my site tonight. I've been that person chasing the speaker for the slides. They are online right now. Let's head off to robrich.org. We'll click on presentations right here at the top. And here's gaining confidence with Cypress Tests. You can view the slides and the code that's up on GitHub right now. While you're here on robrich.org, let's click on About Me and see some of the things that I've done recently. Thank you for the introduction. I'm a Microsoft MVP, a friend of Redgate. I'm a Cyral developer advocate. And AZ Give Camp is really fun. AZ Give Camp brings volunteer developers together with charities to build free software. We start Friday after work. Sunday afternoon, we deliver that completed software to the charities. Sleep is optional, caffeine provided. If you're in Phoenix, come join us for the next AZ Give Camp. Or if you'd like a Give Camp in your neighborhood, hit me up on email or Twitter, and let's get a Give Camp in your neighborhood too. Some of the other things that I've done, I worked on Gulp in version 2 and version 3 as a core contributor. And I replied to a .NET Rocks podcast episode. They read my comment on the air and they sent me a mug. Woo! So there's my claim to fame, my coveted .NET Rocks mug. So let's dig into Cypress Tests. Now, I'm not quite sure if my demos are going to work. So give me a second. Let me see if I can fire up these tests and validate that my site works as expected. Let's go launch some Cypress and kick off some tests. It's doing the TypeScript compile there. There we go. So let's see. Are my tests going to work? Is my site behaving as I expect? Yep, it looks like all the tests are green. I think this talk may go pretty well. Okay, so let's go dive in. What is Cypress? We talked about this guy. So we saw Cypress a little bit. Cypress is this browser-based piece for functional tests, integration tests. Cypress likes to call them end-to-end tests. It's an Electron app and a browser plugin. It's built on top of Mocha and Chai, and it's a really elegant way to build these end-to-end, these integration, these functional tests. Like many good stories, we started in the middle. Let's back up a little bit and talk about the types of tests we might want to write and the context that we want to put them in. Now, we are going to zoom into browser testing. If you're testing a mobile app or if you're testing a desktop app, you will likely use different tools. But here in the browser world, we probably want to write tests in these general areas. We want to test from here down. We could call these end-to-end tests. We want to test this API. Maybe it's a REST or a GraphQL or a gRPC API. We want to test this service. And in this case, what I mean by service is this small piece of functionality. I want to write a unit test. I want to test this component. Now we have a visual piece to it where we want to click buttons, or I want to test that it works in this browser. Now, the works in this browser is less important now that we have more standardized evergreen browsers, but these are kind of the groups of tests. And the interesting thing is for each of these groups of tests, I will use a different tool. If I'm going to unit test something, I will use Mocha with Chai, or I'll use Jest. If I want to unit test something in a particular browser, I'll use Karma. Karma is really good at launching those unit tests in each browser. Now, these aren't integration tests. These aren't UI tests. I'm not clicking any buttons. I'm just running unit tests in that browser. At the point where I have a UI, now I want to run component tests. TestUtils is a great library that can mount Angular, React, or Vue components and then be able to either render all of the child components or use stubs to fake out the child components and then validate interactions with those components. If I'm doing an API, I don't need a browser at all. I can use Supertest to just make requests to that API. And when I'm doing end-to-end tests, I could use Selenium, Cypress, Test Cafe, Playwright, or others. So let's double click into the end-to-end test, Selenium. Selenium uses WebDriver, and WebDriver is an industry standard and is baked into most browsers. I'm looking at you, Internet Explorer. And so with Selenium, I can also write in many languages, JavaScript, C#, Java, Ruby. There's lots of compatibility here with Selenium. And in fact, there is a test recorder baked into Selenium that allows me to take a first stab at writing the code just by clicking buttons. Now, on the upside, it has lots of compatibility. On the downside, it's basically just moving the mouse and clicking it, typing. So we don't get a whole lot of browser interaction. So to compensate for that, we have to do a lot of waits. Is that content loaded yet? I don't know. Let me wait longer. By comparison, Cypress is a browser plugin. So we can integrate deeply into the browser to be able to see when events happen. So let me wait until this request is done, or let me wait until this content is visible. At that point, then Cypress can continue on. Cypress is based in JavaScript or TypeScript, and it works on those browsers that they support. We've got Chrome, we've got Firefox, we've got Edge. Sadly, Safari is still in the works. On the upside, it is great at being able to dig into the browser and do great things. On the downside, we do have some compatibility issues, especially with Safari. It has a jQuery-like API, and if you're familiar with jQuery, then it might feel right at home. But if you're looking at it just like promises, it may feel a little weird. Next, Test Cafe. If you're using DevExpress components for other things, Test Cafe may feel right at home. It uses CSS selectors, so unlike jQuery, I don't have a .then mechanism. On the downside, it isn't built on Mocha or Jest. It has its own assertion and test runner library, so that syntax is kind of weird. With Test Cafe, I'm actually marshalling things back and forth between the test runner that is running inside Node and the browser. And so I'm doing all of this marshal, copy content between those two contexts. I need to understand that both pieces are there. Similarly with Playwright, I'm going to spend a lot of time marshaling content back and forth. Playwright was written by the developers who built Puppeteer. Puppeteer is a great way to automate a browser. And so Playwright inherits a lot of that a lot of that methodology. And so, well, Playwright is great at interacting with browsers, but it feels a lot like the assertion library was an afterthought. So Playwright does have a lot of support in different languages: JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, C#, Go, and others. And it feels a lot like Puppeteer. If you're comfortable with Puppeteer, you'll feel right at home with Playwright. But you'll also need to marshal content back and forth, and it feels a little weird. So those are kind of the things that you might choose, all of the different libraries and different environments. And as we double click into integration tests, the libraries you might choose. In this case, we're going to choose Cypress. To get started with Cypress, we just install it, npm install, and then we'll do an npx cypress open. And that pops open the UI. The first time it pops open, it will actually scaffold out a bunch of tests, which is wonderful. It'll scaffold out tests that run on a Cypress kitchen sink site and show you examples of how to run all of the pieces. Let's take a look at that Cypress IDE. I've done a Cypress open and I get to here. Here's all of those example tests that it built for me. Now, in this case, I'm not going to run those, but here I can choose which browser I want to run in. It's going to discover all of the browsers that it supports that are on my machine. So I've got Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and it has Electron, which is built into Cypress. So if I'm running on a headless DevOps server, a CI platform, then I can use the built-in Electron if I don't apt-get all the pieces of whatever other browser I need. In this case, I'll use Chrome. And now I can either choose to run all my tests, or I can pop open a particular test and run it. Once I've popped open that test, I am now in the regular browser. Now notice that here is my regular browser, and here is the browser that is running my Cypress tests. It started a new incognito-like browser so that it has a separate profile. I'm not inheriting all of the cookies from my local machine. I get a unique new environment that I can run my tests in. Now here on the left, we see the list of tests, and here on the right, we see the site as it's getting tested. So it looks like in this case, all of our tests passed. That's perfect. With each test, I can take a look at each of the steps, and I can see the site at that step. Now, I can see this red dot right here where it chose to click. And now that's the spot that it clicked on. Well, what if I picked the wrong thing? I can click this selector and I can go wander through my site and I can get at a new thing. And it will actually give me the Cypress code sci.get that I need to be able to get at that content. Now, because this is a browser, I can open up the F12 developer tools and I can see the content at that step. So as I navigate up and down, you'll see the console output changes based on the content at that particular step. And to that end, if I want to, I can flip over into the sources and I can set a breakpoint and I can stop at that spot and debug around and see why that test is failing. We are really in a real browser. So that's a quick trip around the Cypress IDE. Let's dig in now to a little bit of the code. Now, by default, Cypress will run with JavaScript, but in the code example that I used TypeScript. You can grab this code on GitHub, go to github.com/robrich/gaining confidence with Cypress tests, or go to robrich.org, click on presentations, and get there straight away. In this code base, our first stop is this cypress.json file. This got scaffolded for us. In this cypress.json file, it lists the plugins file, and that's where the rest of the configuration begins. Here's that path to the plugins file. Now, I chose instead of tests, instead of integration/Cypress, I chose to put it in a test/Cypress folder. Inside the test/Cypress folder, inside plugins index, is the rest of the configuration. Here's where all of the rest of my folders are. My fixtures folder, my integration folder, that's where all my unit tests are. My screenshots folder, videos folder, I chose to put these in a results folder so that I can add that to my git ignore and not need to ignore specific directories. Then I also have a support file. We'll come back to these other files, but let's first dig into a particular test. So here's our test. This is the to-do MVC test, the one that we've been running. Now, I'll start off and I'll create a describe block. This is mocha and chai, so I can do all the things. I'm going to do it before each. Then we'll do a sci.visit to this site URL. Now, the site URL is based on to-do MVC. To-do MVC is a smidge dated now, but the goal of this project is to create an MVC app in lots of different frameworks. So the theory is if you're given a CSS file and an HTML file, build a SPA in that framework. So here in the test, I could switch this to use AngularJS or Backbone or Vue, or we could flip over to React or Angular. And I just uncomment this to get a new site. So before each, I'll go visit that site. Now here's my first test, It should visit the page. I will say sci.url, go get that URL after having visited that site, and it should equal that site URL. Now this was perfect. The first time that I wrote this site, they were still using HTTP. And they flipped over to HTTPS, and I'm really glad I had this test because I was able to see this test failure and catch that they had automatically redirected me to HTTPS. So we'll use that same methodology for unit testing. And you notice there's no wait. I didn't need to wait for the page to load. By the time this sci.visit finishes, the page is already there. I can go grab the URL and I can validate it And you'll notice that this feels a lot like jQuery. Okay, next up, let's do our next test where we start to interact with the page. I've already visited the page. I did that before each test. And I want to now go get the list items inside the to-do. Okay, so none should exist yet. I haven't created any. And so I can see that I go pick those and I say dot should not exist. Perfect. If those to-do items don't exist, I know that I'm in a clean state and I can begin. We see the arrange, act, assert pattern. Arrange, set up the environment that we need, act, go do the action, and then assert to validate that it is as we expect. Now, the sci.visit is part of our arrange. It happened before this test began. And so let's create a new to-do. I'll go visit the page. I'll go get that .new to-do box. There's that input box, and I will type into that box. Now I'm going to type that new to-do text. And then I'm going to push enter. Now notice that this curly brace enter is not blue. It doesn't have the $ in front of it, so it's not swapped in by JavaScript. But it is that magic word that Cypress knows to push the enter key. We could push function keys. We could push shift, control, all of the other interesting keys. And in this case, I chose to push the enter key. So I've typed in that new to-do box, I have typed my to-do and I pushed enter. Now it should show up in the list. So let's go get that list again, and it should contain this new to-do text. That's perfect. Let's go get that new to-do box, enter a new to-do box, and it should have a blank value. So as part of typing this, it will create that new list item, and it will clear out the input box. And I validated both pieces. Now that's great. We've started to type into that box. Let's level up again. I want to mark a to-do as completed. So first step, I'm going to type an irrelevant to-do, something that I know that as I complete the one that I do want to do, I won't accidentally check the wrong box. Okay, now I'll type my new to-do. Here's my new to-do that I want to do, finish Cypress test. I will push enter. And now let me go find the view that contains that new to-do text. Now, this syntax is a little weird. Ideally, I would more tightly control the CSS. I would create a selector that would very specifically get me to this new to-do item. But okay, this syntax is not bad. I didn't build the site. I didn't have a whole lot of control over it. So I can do this, and I can put in a filter to be able to get at the specific item. Now that's kind of cool. It feels very jQuery-esque. Now let me go find that toggle button inside this new to-do, and I will click it. That will mark it as completed. Okay, so I've acted out all of the things. Let's go validate that it should have a class of completed. Now that's that CSS class that does the strike through in the to-do. So I go find my to-do item, and I should have a class of completed. Now this validates that I didn't accidentally check the box on the irrelevant to-do, that I actually checked the box on the to-do I was expecting. That's perfect. Let's level up again. Now let's delete a to-do. Okay, so I'm going to create an irrelevant to-do. I'm going to create my new to-do. And then let me go find the destroy button. Now that destroy button actually only shows up when I hover. If we count, nope, the test isn't up. If we hover over that spot, then we will get that checkbox and we can delete it. Now, because it's not visible right now, I can't click it by default. But Cypress isn't running the CSS selectors, it's only running the JavaScript. And because of that, I have to say force equals true. Now, force true means I want to click it even though it's not visible. In this case, that was the correct solution. Let me go validate that my list now should have length 1, and it should contain that irrelevant to-do, not the to-do that I expected to click on. Perfect. I just deleted a to-do. Now, I'm noticing that I'm doing some redundancy here. I'm typing out each thing, and it's not super clear. I want to show only active tasks. I'm going to create 2 new irrelevant tasks and then the one that I want to do. But that's kind of a lot of stuff. Let's create a new command called to-do add. And inside this to-do add, we'll just be able to add that text and go create it. So to build these commands inside Cypress, we'll come inside the commands, the index.ts file. Here's that support file, and we'll import those commands. Here's the command that I wanted to create. I wanted to create to-do add. It takes in some text. It calls .new to-do, type that text and pushes enter, and then validates that the input box is blank after it finished adding it. Now that's perfect. Now that I've created this command, I can come back into my test and just say to-do add. Well, except for this is TypeScript. How do I get TypeScript to know that this command exists? Back in the Cypress docs, we can take a look at this section for TypeScript, and we can see that if we want to add this command, we also need to tell TypeScript based on a type declaration how to build that command as well. Okay, so here in Cypress, we're going to create that .d.ts file, and that's that to-do add piece. Perfect. Back in our test, we have now created that new to-do, and now this function gives us a whole lot more context on what we're doing. I am creating a new to-do. I will then say to-do complete. Here's another command where instead of typing out all of the pieces, I can just go find that view that matches that particular item and toggle the click button. All of the particulars of how to accomplish this task is abstracted away in a place that I can reuse. That's perfect. Now let's go find the active button and click it and validate that we should only have 2 left. Now this introduced us to commands, which was really, really effective. It should only show completed tasks. We'll use our commands again. We'll go find the completed button and click it. And now we'll go get that list, and it should only have length 1. Only the one that is completed, not the 2 that are undone. And I'll do the same thing just for completeness. I'll go click the delete completed tasks or clear completed tasks. Let me add one, let me complete it, and then I'll go find that clear completed button, and I will click it, and now I should have no to-do items. So back in Cypress, if we launch this test, we can see it's going to do each of those steps. Now, first thing, it's going to load the site at the beginning of each test. Then it will be able to run those tests. Let me enter a new to-do. Let me validate that by entering the new to-do, I only have 1 left. Here's that TypeScript compile step. So let's go grab that. We'll mark a to-do as complete. And notice how fast these tests are. We don't need to wait a second for the thing to enter. We just wait for the browser to finish the previous step. And that worked out great. Well, let's level up again. Let's take a look at this test. Now, in this test, I'm consuming an external source. This test is based on Hacker News PWA. And Hacker News PWA is kind of that successor to To-Do MVC, where instead of just showing a static site, we're actually consuming Hacker News and showing that content. Well, that's interesting, but I want to build a test that will go pull down live content. Will that live content have the content that I need? How do I validate that I've put the correct item in place, that I've rendered that piece? Let's take a look at the code that will show how this one works. And the back end wasn't ready yet. There we go. And we can see that this test passed. So here's the code for that one, Hacker News PWA. Again, I'll start off by picking the type of API that I want. I will create a should visit site. And now I want to make sure that it should have a specific top story. Now, I can't assume what the API is going to return. So let me intercept that request and return this fixture, this Hacker News fixture. Here's this Hacker News fixture, and I know that this is the title of that first story. Okay, so now because I have a fake data set, when I go visit it, I can ensure that the first item should contain that title. I know what the title is going to be. Now, it's easy if I create a fixture to lie to myself that the API will always behave the same. So I don't want to create only one test that way, but I'm also going to create another test that will just go hit the API and validate that I have 30 items in the list. I don't know what those items are, but I'm going to guess that Hacker News always has 30 items on their homepage. Now, if that API call took a particularly long time, I could name this and specifically wait for it. But in most cases, Cypress is going to do pretty good and just wait as long as it needs to. You can see in this test, oh, the API is actually not loading correctly. So we got to see a test where we could interact with the browser. We got to see where we could fake out things, some best practices. Now, in this case, we didn't have access to control the endpoint site, but in most cases, it's better to create a data-cy element attribute on each element. And now we know very specifically that that is for this test. Now we can do a cy.get and specifically name that thing and pull in exactly that piece. Yes, we are exposing test data to production, but that also means that you can run some of these tests in production as well. If you can't get an attribute here, use an ID or a class, but know that as you refactor your application, those IDs and classes may change. In the worst scenario, you have this nested path of how to get to that element that you want, and that's really fragile. You want to avoid that at all costs. Ideally, you name the element that you want and you go get it. Similarly, a best practice is to create these commands that you can use frequently to tell the story that you want to tell. We created an add new task command because duplicating that code didn't make a lot of sense. And now our tests are a lot more legible because we've got each of those steps called out. Now, one of the things that I love is as you grab these slides from robrich.org, click on each of these blue links and you can get to the site that talks about this particular piece. Here's another best practice that Cypress calls out. You don't need to log in at the beginning of every test. Instead, log in once at the beginning of your suite and use that token in all of the rest of the tests. You do want to verify your login works as expected, but you don't need to log in at the beginning of every test. That would make your test slower. Instead, go get a token, maybe from an API that is only available in non-production environments, and then use that token in all of the rest of the tests. Your goal is to validate that your business function works, not that your login page works 20 times or 200 times. Another good best practice, use mock data when you can to be able to create specific environments so you can establish specific behaviors. If your API returns non-deterministic data, this is a great way to be able to validate specific pieces. But make sure that you don't lie to yourself and actually do create one test that calls the real API, validating results that you know will be identical. In our case, we validated that we had 30 results coming back from Hacker News. Cypress is a really fun environment to be able to create these integration tests. If you've gotten burned by having to increase the sleep time in Selenium or another test framework, then Cypress might be a whole lot faster and a whole lot more fun. This has been a lot of fun showing you Cypress. I look forward to your questions. If you're watching this later, ask me questions on Twitter at @Rob_Rich. You can grab the slides right now at robrich.org. For those of you who are here live in the conference, what are your questions? What are your thoughts?
All right, thank you, Rob. We do have a couple of questions, but first, just thank you again. Please show your love on the chat as well. And I really like Cypress. Actually, at Prezi, we just started using it a couple of months, and it's just exploding. Like a lot of the TypeScript developers are just on it. Like it's really fun, like you said. So the first question that we have here, would you recommend Cypress to test web accessibility?
Testing web accessibility, that is a great question. Automated tools are only so good at validating accessibility because they make some assumptions, like if it's visible on the page, users can see it, or if it's contrasty enough, it's usable. I would love to be able to use Cypress or other tools to validate accessibility, but you can only go so far. At the end of the day, you need to find somebody who is abled in this way, who can validate if you're doing enough. Ideally, we've got machines doing work instead of humans, but in the case of accessibility, humans with these special abilities are really the best person to test accessibility.
Very true, very true. I've gone through that ups and downs, right? There's like solutions that say that are able to test it all, but you're right. At the end of the day, it's actually down to the humans that are able to actually put the kind of, it is actually performing the way that they experience it, not like how computers are.
Right.
Cool. Then the next up is actually for me because with Prezi, right, we started Selenium. We had a bunch of tests in Selenium. And we've managed our way through to get into Cypress, and we're still on that. But how would you recommend somebody getting started with that, right? For us, it was kind of like a mixed match. Do you have any recommendations for that kind of going from Selenium to Cypress?
I think if you move from Selenium to Cypress, you will be pleasantly surprised. You don't need to do a big bang. You don't need to convert every test before you do a commit. With all testing practices, the hardest part is to get test one. And so find a place that is really easy to test. Maybe it's the login page. Maybe it's that critical business path, the shopping cart and checkout experience. Don't actually put in a credit card and purchase, but do everything up to that point. And if you get that test in place in Cypress or whichever tool you choose, now get that test to run as part of your DevOps pipeline. Get your build to fail if that test doesn't succeed. Now that you've gotten one, you've established a pattern that you can leverage in lots of other places. If you want to pull in other pieces that you want to test, if you want to test other scenarios, now you have a reference code to look at, and you have the ability to scale those out. If you've got a suite of Selenium tests, grab the one that is the most fragile, grab the one that is the most critical to the business, and replicate that in Cypress. Now, if you use JavaScript to build your Selenium tests, it may just be a matter of switching out the Selenium WebDriver calls with the Cypress calls. You can turn your Selenium page state things into Cypress commands. If you're coming from another language, maybe you wrote your Selenium tests in Ruby or C# or Java, then that's a little bit more work.
Gotcha. Cool. We have another question around, do you recommend parallel test when using Cypress.js?
Yes, parallelizing these tests is a great way to make them run faster. Not to say that they're running any faster, but I'm doing more work in parallel. Now, it's possible if you run it in extremely parallel scenarios to bury your API in the course of doing these tests. So do be conscious of the load that you're putting on your system as you do these tests. But ideally, 5 or 10 or 100 parallel Selenium tests is a lot less than 1,000 or 1,000,000 concurrent users. So ideally, load shouldn't be a concern. But the more you can parallelize these tests, the more you can take advantage of cloud utility computing and be able to get at that result faster. My goal for a DevOps pipeline is to complete the entire set in 10 minutes. And the more integration tests you have, the slower that is. So it's tempting to say, but we just need this patch right now. Let's just turn off integration tests. It's never going to get turned back on.
Yeah.
Find a way to run your tests in parallel as fast as you can, and always have those as a gate before you deploy.
Very good recommendations, yeah. Then we have another question from Tomasz Kish. Do you think Cypress has a quick enough feedback cycle for practicing TDD with it?
Yes, I do. And I've actually used Cypress to TDD a website, and it worked out really well. Together with test utils, sometimes it's really fun to be able to mount a component and poke at it and do all of the things that I need to. Cypress is a great playground.
Nice, nice. And just curious, do you have any links on your site to kind of get started with TDD with Cypress?
I don't, but that sounds like a great blog post, and I'll take that challenge.
Cool. Good stuff. So another question here. Actually, so sounds great. Do you know if there is some kind of .NET binding for it? So we could use it. So we can use this nice runner from .NET source code as well.
That is a great question. Cypress is written in JavaScript. So unfortunately, you can't write the tests in .NET and run them in Cypress like you can with Selenium. Puppeteer might be a better fit for you in that case, because Puppeteer does have a lot of different language options. Cypress is very specifically JavaScript. And what's beautiful there is that the language that's running inside the browser is also JavaScript. And so we can blur that line. Unlike Puppeteer and Test Cafe, we don't have to marshal data back and forth between the browser context and the test context. We can just run the test. Mm-hmm. And so by being JavaScript, by being that language that runs in the browser, it makes that kind of blurred line possible. If we were trying to run .NET, yeah, there's WASM ways to do interesting things, but Cypress is really a JavaScript tool. In this case, I use TypeScript. And so if you're coming from C#, using those extra type helpings inside of TypeScript can be a really elegant way to have that same compile safety while still working in the realm of browsers. TypeScript is a great tool.
Definitely, definitely. And we also actually, from him, he has a comment rather than a question, which is AZ Gift Camp is a great idea. Congrats for participating in such a nice movement. +1 for me as well.
Thanks.
Now,
our 10th year is coming up. Our 10th year was going to be 2020, but we got pandemicked. So join us for the next AZ Gift Camp. It will be a lot of fun.
Nice, nice. Yes. Actually, is that a US based only, or is that worldwide? That's something I didn't actually understand.
Gift Camp, the organization, is a worldwide organization. And AZ Gift Camp just happens to be the Arizona chapter of it. Mm-hmm. But there's nothing that says that Gift Camp is specific to the US. I know a lot of them in the US because that's the perspective that I have on the world. But if you'd like to prop up a Gift Camp in any part of the world, I'd love to help.
Cool. Actually, that's a really good invitation. All right. Another question would be, would you run Cypress in production? Are there any benefits to that? As
yes.
In against production code, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Or production systems.
Oh, I would even say run it in the production environment.
Exactly.
If you have those data-cy attributes on your code running in production, run some Cypress tests that will smoke test your production environment and run those tests once an hour maybe. Now you've validated that your site is functioning correctly from a user's perspective in production. Now don't do any terminal activities. Don't create any purchases or send any emails or charge credit cards that way. But validate that the critical paths of your application are functioning in production the way you expect. It's really painful when your users have to tell you that your site is down. Instead, get Cypress to run frequently and get Cypress to tell you when your site is having issues. Now you can take corrective action, maybe even before the users notice.
Yeah, I really like that, actually. So you can actually hook it up to your monitoring system in that sense, and then just get alerted when Cypress actually fails. So it's kind of like a test in production, but it's actually the health of your production system.
Yes.
That's actually
and it's not the health of your production system from the container's perspective or from your application's perspective. It's the health of your system from an external remote browser's perspective.
Yeah, you can actually, since you can deploy cloud any parts of the world, you can even actually have it monitor around the whole globe in that sense. So you have like, how does it look from Europe or US or in China or such and such. So you can even get that kind of perspective.
And we're starting to blur the line into something like pingdom, where we just want to measure latency to our website. In that case, you might want to set pingdom up in each environment, or maybe another ping tool. But these tests, making sure that they run from outside of your standard data center, is really helpful. What happens if the connection into the data center goes down, but my Cypress test is running in the same cluster as my production system?
Correct.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But if Cypress is running just outside of that region, then now I know.
Yeah, yeah, and you can kind of monitor more complex scenarios, right? Sometimes you need to log in and do other stuff. So pingdom just gives you it's live, but is it doing the thing that you think it should do, right? And this is where the combination of both kind of comes in.
Yeah.
Cool.
There was one site that I knew that always responded with 200, even the error page. And so the ping tools were great at validating that it got a 200, but they weren't great at noticing that that 200 page was actually the error page.
Yeah. I actually been there once, so I can definitely relate to that pain. But quickly, we actually caught that in testing. So we were like, oh, and all right, let's correct this.
Yes.
Well, Rob, thank you so much.